By the dawn of the 20th century, the quote-unquote Wild West was, for the most part, a fading memory. Billy the Kid, Wild Bill Hickok, and John Wesley Hardin were all 6 feet under. The buffalo were gone, the indigenous on reservation, and the once vast prairie now overrun by civilization. The frontier, for all intents and purposes, had finally been tamed. But I guess no one bothered to tell Harry Tracy. Considered by some to be the last of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, Tracy blasted his way out of prison in the summer of 1902. And what followed was one of the most desperate manhunts in all of U.S. history. Over the course of the next 2 months, this Old West throwback would lead over 1,000 lawmen, including the National Guard, on a deadly game of chase that would see at least 7 men gunned down. According to the papers of his time, in all the criminal lore of the country, there is no record equal to that of Harry Tracy for cold-blooded nerve, desperation, and the thirst for crime. Jesse James, compared with Tracy, is a Sunday school teacher. But who was the real Harry Tracy? Where'd he come from? What started him on a life of crime? And was he really the last of the Wild Bunch? My name's Josh, and you're listening to the Wild West Extravaganza. Harry Tracy's real name wasn't Tracy. It was Severns. And Harry Severns was born sometime around the year 1875 near Pittsville, Wisconsin. His father, Orlando, was a forester by trade, and his granddaddy, the local justice of the peace. By all accounts, just a nice, upstanding family. Sadly, not all was as it appeared. In 1889, Orlando Severns was elected as treasurer for a newly formed school board and put in charge of collecting finances for construction. And once Orlando obtained said money, he took off, abandoning his wife and kids in the process. Now, Harry would have been around 13 or 14 at this time, and I don't know that he was ever again in contact with his father. Matter of fact, Orlando would pass away just a few years later in Kansas, having already remarried. And to be perfectly honest with you, I just don't have a whole hell of a lot more information on the rest of Harry's early life. There are rumors galore, though. Boy, howdy are there. I know this applies to a lot of the historical figures we cover here on the Wild West Extravaganza, but man, oh man, is there a lot of misinformation out there on old Harry Tracy, much of which originated later when Harry was on the lam, and with very little in the way of actual evidence, like the stories of him raping and murdering his own Sunday school teacher, or that he killed a neighbor there in Wisconsin with an axe. Now, the general narrative is that Tracy spent some time working in the stockyards of Chicago and the gold diggings of Colorado before heading up to Montana and trying his hand at working cattle, an occupation that soon devolved to him just rustling livestock. They say Harry killed a sheriff's deputy up there in the Big Sky country and drifted back south to Colorado, where he continued to kill. And of course, somewhere along the way, he joined up with Butch Cassidy. Hell, there's even a movie about it. 1982's Harry Tracy, the last of the Wild Bunch, starring Bruce Dern. Still alive, Bruce Dern. I went down a little rabbit hole, and damn. Dude is 87 years old at the time of this recording and still making movies. And just this year alone, Dern has already appeared in 5 films. Very impressive for his age, and I guess it just goes to show that if you do what you love, you'll never need to retire. Don't see a lot of forklift drivers who are 87 years old. Wonder why that is. Now, as far as Harry Tracy goes, like I said, the stories abound. There's claims that he had multiple wives from Missouri all the way to Montana, that he was a Mexican, and of course that he was involved in scores of shootouts and murders all before the tender age of 20. And from what I was able to find, almost none of that is true, including the assertions that he rode with Butch Cassidy. Per historian and Tracy biographer Jim Delunty, quote, Harry Tracy was almost certainly not a member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, though he has been reported as such so many times that it's nearly accepted as fact, end quote. Delunty goes on to write that this is the single hardest Harry Tracy myth to knock down, primarily due to so many other respected writers having also made the claim. Once again, to quote Mr. Delunty, everything written about Tracy's life, especially his early years, is a bunch of malarkey. His words, not mine. But I gotta admit, it is kind of fun saying malarkey. Try it out. Malarkey. Don't worry, we will talk more about whether Harry did or did not ride with Butch Cassidy here very shortly. But needless to say, I did have a very hard time separating fact from fiction. So much so that I almost didn't even record this episode. Even a book I leaned on heavily while doing research, The Saga of the Outlaw Harry Tracy by James J. Nystrom, is very sparse when it comes to the details of Tracy's early life. Another title, Harry Tracy, The Last Desperado, by the aforementioned Jim Delente, I believe would have proved an invaluable source, but unfortunately I was unable to get my hands on a copy. So my apologies in advance. This was one of the harder nuts to crack as far as origin stories go, but hopefully I didn't get too much wrong. And as tends to be the case, things do clear up quite a bit more as we progress. With that disclaimer out of the way, we also don't know when Harry Severance took on the Tracy alias, or why. Some say it was his middle name, and yet others believe that Tracy was his stepfather's last name, even though there's no documentation that his mother was ever married to anyone named Tracy. Who knows, man? Maybe Harry just thought it sounded cool, which, I mean, come on, it kinda does, right? Now, despite what you may hear elsewhere, Tracy's first known crime appears to have occurred sometime when he was around 19 or 20. He has still been living in Wisconsin, right next door to his mother. You can find him there in the 1895 census, but he soon joined a threshing crew working over in the Dakotas. Harry asked to borrow $2 from a coworker, and when the loan was refused, he simply went ahead and took it anyway, and ran off just like his father before him. From there, it looks like Tracy headed all the way to Spokane, Washington, where he took up employment as a lumberjack before being ran out of town after getting caught dilly-dallying a married lady. There's evidence that he spent that winter in Montana and then possibly back to Washington, where he operated as a thief in Seattle under the alias of Tom Bliss. Luckily, by the summer of 1897, things do get a little easier to track. Tracy, who would have still been in his early 20s at the time, for sure made his way down to Utah, where he got himself arrested for robbing a store in Provo. He would be tried, found guilty, and sentenced to the Utah State Penitentiary. Not a very long incarceration, though. As you'll soon hear, Harry Tracy was quite the escape artist. He and a friend, David Lant, would bust out of the clink sometime in either late 1897 or early 98 and drift east to an isolated mountain valley known as Brown's Park, or sometimes referred to as Brown's Hole. Now, this area is located on the Green River in the extreme northeastern portion of Utah, northwestern Colorado, and south central Wyoming. It's where the Bassett Ranch was located. Shout out to historical hotties Ann and Josie Bassett, along with the infamous Jarvie Trading Post. And the park also just happened to be a favorite hangout of Butch Cassidy's, which is at least part of the reason it's thought that Tracy once rode with the Wild Bunch. And speaking of that, to be fair, there are just so many references to Harry Tracy being a member of the Hole in the Wall gang, or at least being an associate of other members like Flatnose George Curry, that one has to assume there must be at least a little truth to it. But like I mentioned earlier, historian Jim Delente disagrees, as does Butch Cassidy biographer Richard Patterson. Speaking of Tracy, Patterson wrote, quote, "With one exception, nothing suggesting a connection has ever been uncovered. Cary Ross Boren, the lone exception, says his grandfather, who was supposed to have known Butch, claimed that Butch personally ordered Tracy to leave Brown's Park." End quote. All other references to Tracy being part of the Hole in the Wall gang come from newspaper accounts years after the fact, and nobody, so far as I can tell, has been able to locate any additional hard evidence. Is it possible that Harry knew the Wild Bunch, or even brushed shoulders with Butch Cassidy during his brief stay in the Brown Park region? Sure. But at this point, I think it's safe to say that they never rode together or conspired to commit crimes or anything like that. What we do know is that Tracy and his jailbreak buddy Dave fell in with a couple other hard cases, one of whom, Pat Johnson, was wanted for a recent murder. They had it in mind to flee south together for Robbers Roost, but Sheriff Charles Neiman out of Routt County, Colorado, had other plans. He and his men soon located the bandits, and following a brief gunfight that saw posse member Valentine Hoy shot dead by our very own Harry Tracy, the wanted men finally surrendered, Tracy doing so begrudgingly. Now, this was in early March 1898. Harry and Dave were locked up in the Routt County Jail, but just like back in Utah, it would be a very brief stay. A few weeks later, on the morning of March 24th, the outlaw duo managed to slip out of their cells and overpower Sheriff Neiman. Truth be told, they damn near killed the man. Or should I say Harry Tracy damn near killed the man. Supposedly, Dave Lant had to beg Harry numerous times to stop from beating the sheriff plumb to death. And this is a trend we'll see popping up quite a bit on today's episode. As will soon become evident, anybody that stood between Harry Tracy and freedom absolutely did so at their own peril. As far as Sheriff Neiman goes, credit to where credit's due, as he was apparently one tough old cob. Despite being severely beaten and locked in his own jail, Neiman was able to get loose, and although I'm sure he was nursing one hell of a headache, was able to track down and recapture the escapees that very same day. Harry and Lant were then moved to the more secure jail in Aspen, which was said to be escape-proof, but you know how that goes. On the 22nd of June, almost 3 months after their last flight to freedom, Tracy and Lant once more made a break for it. I guess Harry had carved a fake wooden gun, wrapped it up in tinfoil, and the bluff worked. Both he and Dave were once more free men. The pair made their way to Breckenridge, robbed $150 from a craps game, the first armed robbery ever committed in Breckenridge, and just a few days later, they did the same in the now ghost town of Kokomo, taking several $100s each from a saloon and an Oddfellows lodge. Now, Dave Lant was a Mormon, and I guess he either came to his senses or developed a guilty conscience, as he and Tracy would soon part company. Years later, Lant would be cited for bravery during the Spanish-American War, and die a respected businessman. Sadly, we can't say the same for his buddy. Harry fled first to Billings, Montana, but soon returned to the Pacific Northwest, where he briefly found refuge in Seattle's Skid Row before continuing south to Portland, Oregon. And somewhere along the way, he fell in with his next partner in crime, Dave Merrill. For whatever reason, I guess Tracy was partial to having friends named Dave. Now, this was another gray area of Harry's life, and I had a very difficult time putting all the pieces together. I could not ascertain exactly where or when he met Merrill. Some sources say Montana, and still others Seattle. What's certain is that once the pair partnered up, they embarked on what can only be described as an epic crime spree down in Portland, brazenly robbing businesses in broad daylight. Hell, on at least one occasion, they even held up a damn police officer, as the papers took to calling them the Mackinac Bandits. Now, it wasn't just Dave Merrill who Tracy hit it off with. He also took quite the shine to Dave's sister Rose. You may even find accounts stating that the pair were married. However, Harry would later deny this. Just to be clear, Tracy and Rose were most definitely romantically involved. It's just not known for sure if vows were ever swapped or if they was just living in sin. Now, eventually, the 5-0 was tipped off to stolen swag being held at the Merrill home, and Dave was apprehended. Wrongly assuming that Tracy had snitched him out, Merrill let the authorities know that Tracy would be arriving shortly for a visit. The cops staked the place out, and sure enough, here comes Tracy, completely unaware as to what had transpired in his absence. An arrest was attempted, which led to a short gunfight between Harry and a lawman before a nearby butcher got involved and took Tracy down with a blast from his shotgun. The end. No, sounds pretty severe, but in reality, the wound was light. A pellet simply glanced off Harry's skull, momentarily stunning him long enough for the cops to make the arrest. And as it turns out, that butcher was one of Tracy's recent robbery victims, who evidently was fed up with people stealing his shit. Now, Harry was found guilty of robbery, but somehow, while awaiting his sentence, he got his hands on a pistol, and he wasted no time in pulling it on a jail guard and demanding his immediate release. The screw fell to his knees and begged Tracy not to kill him, but held firm and refused to open up the cell, said he'd rather die than do that. And Tracy, realizing the futility of the situation, simply let the guard go. I guess he figured that even if he killed him, he'd still be locked up in the jail, so what's the point? And with an extra charge to boot, which he ended up getting anyway. Other guards arrived and began shooting towards the cell. Tracy returned fire, but once again, what's the point, right? Harry surrendered, and on top of that 13 years he got for robbery, he was given an additional 7 for this little failed escape. Harry Tracy was not yet 25 years of age and destined to spend the next 2 decades behind bars. On paper, at least. Turns out the young bandit had other plans. Not quite yet, though. Harry would be sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary, and as luck would have it, his cellmate was none other than Dave Merrill. Apparently, Dave was initially frightened, thinking that maybe Tracy knew it was him who tipped off the police, but in truth, Harry was clueless, and they fell right back into their old friendship. Now, the Oregon State Pen, located outside of Salem, was originally built in 1851 and is still in operation to this day. Not sure what the current conditions are like, and I damn sure don't want to find out, but they weren't all that great back at the turn of the century. Forced labor and corporal punishments were the norm, and prisoners were sometimes even murdered by guards. One gruesome killing in particular is worth mentioning. Now, this did take place a little before Tracy arrived, but I think it'll give you an idea just how cheap life was there at the Oregon State Pen. Consider yourself warned, though, what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. All right, I don't want to hear no complaints about your grandkids hearing this. A convict by the name of Delmain was given 10 lashes with a whip as a form of punishment, and as he was cut down from the whipping pole, he struck out defiantly at one of the guards, which resulted in him being tied right back up for an additional lashing. They say Delmain's screams were mere whimpers by blow number 55, yet the guards kept on. 20 lashes more and Delmain was altogether silent. Still, the man of flogs, the guard with the whip was called, continued, raining down blow after blow until he had delivered a horrific 100 lashes. Delmain was then tossed into solitary with 0 medical treatment, and it's there he languished in extreme agony, living only on bread, thin broth, and water for the next 30 days. How he survived that long, I do not know. As it were, he had gone completely out of his mind with pain, and when the guards finally came to fetch him, was found huddled in the corner of his cell, cursing and spitting. A doctor was summoned, and it was determined that the lashes had penetrated all the way to Delmain's spine. To restrain the tortured inmate, his hands were then chained behind his back and his feet fitted with heavy lead-weighted boots. And then, of course, they just threw his ass back in solitary. A few days later, when a guard attempted to give Delmain a bucket of water, he struck out and knocked it to the floor. Enraged, the guard then proceeded to pick up said bucket and bash it repeatedly over Delmain's head, till his skull was cracked open like a damn cantaloupe. The unfortunate inmate was then transferred to an insane asylum where he died shortly thereafter from brain and spinal damage. And just in case you're one of those, he had it coming types, the infraction that led to Delmain's initial 10 lashes was him replying to a guard in a disrespectful tone. That's it. That's all it took. For this grave sin, they severed the man's damn spine with a whip and didn't even so much as toss him an ibuprofen. Good God Almighty. The warden, along with the guard who delivered the lashes, were both dismissed, but I'm not aware of either of them facing criminal charges. Another not as lethal punishment, but torturous nonetheless, involved prisoners being hung up over the top of their cell doors overnight, their hands held in place by shackles, and just forced to dangle without their feet being able to touch the floor. Now, I was unable to determine if Harry ever got hung up in such a fashion or if he was ever forced to receive lashes, but both he and Dave Merrill would fall prey to those previously mentioned weighted boots used to subdue Delmain. Known affectionately as Oregon boots, these were just your regular run-of-the-mill leather shoes fitted with a heavy lead weight that left more than a few inmates crippled, including Dave Merrill. So what did Dave and Tracy do to warrant such a punishment? Well, apparently they were overheard planning an escape, and one of their fellow inmates told on them. But prison officials underestimated the tenacity of Harry Tracy, and it was going to take a whole hell of a lot more than a pair of heavy boots if they planned on keeping him locked up in that prison much longer. Soon enough, Tracy struck a deal with the soon-to-be-released convict, promising the man a large amount of cash in exchange for help in smuggling in a couple of rifles. This in and of itself is a crazy story. If the information I found is true, the former inmate Charles Monty is one of the very few men throughout history found guilty of breaking into a prison. Dude made good on his promise and, using a rope and grappling hook, shimmied up the walls into the yard and snuck into the foundry shop where Tracy and Merrill worked. It's there where Monty stashed a couple of short-barreled Winchester 30-30s along with ammo in a packing crate before sneaking out the same way he came in. FYI, Monty would later receive a life sentence for these efforts. Now, the catch was Harry and Dave did not know when the rifles would arrive, so every day when it was time to go to work, they'd have to shove their way to the front of the line and make sure they was the first to the foundry. This went on for weeks until finally, on the morning of June 9th, 1902, after nearly 3 years behind bars, Harry Tracy found himself standing there in the Oregon State Pen Foundry, looking down at the beautiful sight of 2 well-oiled Winchesters. The guards didn't know it yet, but within mere moments, convict number 4088 was about to turn that prison into a damn war zone. Make no mistake about it, there was no elaborate plot other than pure violent aggression. Tracy was quite literally planning on shooting his way out. His first victim was one of the guards assigned to the foundry. Man was in the process of leisurely rolling himself a smoke when Harry approached, yelling out, "You had your day, now it's mine," followed by a well-placed bullet straight to the back of the head. Tracy continues his attack, pumping round after round at the remaining 2 foundry guards, who, by the way, were unarmed, as Merrill moves to a window and begins firing at the guards outside on the wall. Inmates are running in every direction, trying to avoid becoming collateral damage, and it's a wonder more of them weren't hit. As it were, just one, a convict named Ingram, took a stray round to the back of the knee, and that sounds like it hurts a lot. The leg would later be amputated, and in an effort to drum up good PR, the warden commuted Ingram's sentence by saying that he attempted to disarm Tracy. In truth, he was just scrambling for safety like everybody else. Now, those unarmed guards were able to get away and lock themselves in the prison's chapel, along with several others, so all Tracy and Merrill had to contend with now were the guards out on the wall, one of whom was S.R. Jones. Unfortunately, Mr. Jones made the mistake of exposing himself a little too much, and Harry put a fatal round to the man's chest. Now, at the same time this firefight is occurring, Merrill and Tracy are able to secure a ladder, which they then use to mount one of the walls. And while still under fire, they lift it up over their heads and down to the opposite side. Tracy holds the guards off as Merrill shimmies his way down, and then it's his turn, and lickety-split, just like that, both inmates are now outside the prison walls. It weren't over yet, though. A pair of courageous guards by the name of Tiffany and Ross followed, only to come face to face with the escapees, who quickly disarmed them and used them as human shields. Worth noting, by this point, the guards in the chapel had got their nerve up and obtained firearms, so here they come looking to even the score. The captured guard Tiffany spies one of his colleagues on the wall and motions, on the sly, for him to shoot, which he does, but the shot misses, and Tracy rewards Tiffany by ventilating his skull with a round from that Winchester. More gunfire erupts from the wall, so the remaining hostage, Ross, falls to the ground and plays possum as Merrill and Tracy make their final break, shooting backwards as they rush towards the tree line. Harry Tracy was once again on the run, but he had just left 3 guards in his wake, and the manhunt that followed would be unlike anything ever seen in the Pacific Northwest. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Dave Merrill had been next to useless during this escape, at least as far as Tracy was concerned. It was he, Harry, who had done most of the shooting, and it was also him who killed the 3 guards. And even now, as they made their way through the forest outside of the prison, Tracy was slowed down by Dave's crippled feet. These so-called inadequacies would become a point of friction between the 2 men that would only intensify in the weeks to come. For now, though, their only concern was not getting recaptured, and you better believe Harry Tracy had more than a few tricks up his prison-striped sleeve. Despite the warden calling for immediate assistance and offering up a $1,000 bounty on the fugitives, they were able to make their way to Salem undetected. It was there they received food from a former inmate before moving on and stealing a team of horses. That night, they robbed an innocent passerby of his clothing, divvying up the spoils between the 2 of them. By the next morning, not only was the law out in force, but so was the National Guard. Hell, they even brought in a team of crack bloodhounds all the way from Washington. Locals got in on the action as well. Pretty much anyone who was able to handle a gun was out beating the bush in search of these escapees. Still, Harry and Dave pressed on, and by day 2, they had made it some 15-odd miles to the north, where they skirted the town of Gervais on foot. Yeah, on foot. I know a minute ago I said they stole a team of horses, which was true, but remember, Harry Tracy was nothing if not clever, and this would be a tactic he'd employ more than once. They'd steal a horse or a buggy or what have you, ride a few miles, and then disembark and continue on foot. Invariably, the pursuers would continue following the horse tracks as he and Dave went on their merry way in the opposite direction. Case in point, that very night, near Gervais, they came upon a couple of posse members in a buggy. Tracy and Dave got the slip on them, relieved the men of said buggy along with their weapons and ammunition, but a few miles later, they jumped ship while the buggy was still moving. Believe it or not, this ruse worked time and time again. As far as the bloodhounds go, that's a mite trickier, but Tracy had his ways. Not only would he wade through creeks and swamps as much as possible, throwing off the scent, but he was also just constantly doubling back on his own trail, further confusing matters. Also, for what it's worth, at least one source claimed that it was unseasonably dry and dusty, and that all that dust somehow hampered the hounds. Whether or not that's true, I can't say. All I know is that every time there was a new sighting, the dogs were rushed in, but on damn near every occasion, they'd lose the scent after just a few miles. Now that night, Harry and Dave stayed put, and despite their best efforts, were literally surrounded by armed possemen. Fortunately, most of these men were amateurs, and more than a little drunk, so they were able to break through a line of pickets the next morning, drawing some ineffectual fire in the process, but still able to double back a little while later and rob a few of the struggling and hungover possemen of their guns. Meanwhile, the citizens of Gervais just watched in astonished amusement as the posses just kept running this way and that in a failed and frantic effort to get in front of the wanted men. Later that evening, Tracy and Merrill were spotted once more in a field, and the law quickly assembled. Be that as it may, Marion County Sheriff Frank Durbin was understandably hesitant to order his men into the thick underbrush, fearing ambush. Nonetheless, by nightfall, there were nearly 250 men spread out over a few miles in a large semicircle, along with militia manning all roads leading in and out. Hell, so confident were the authorities that the damn governor of Oregon even showed up in a wagon to witness the dramatic climax. Or so he thought. Despite every man of the posse being on high alert throughout the night, and definitely not taking swigs from their whiskey flasks, wink wink, Tracy and Merrill just slipped quietly through their grasp and lit out once again. And from there, the manhunt just turned into a total shit show. I think there was eventually somewhere around 500 men scouring the Oregon countryside, civilians carrying everything from Grandpa's old squirrel gun to Civil War black powder relics, and yeah, per rumors, most of them were slap drunk. Finally, Sheriff Durbin disbanded everybody and sent them home. He felt like the fugitives were headed for Portland anyway, and there was no sense in trasping about the wilderness and risking the posse members shooting at each other. Durbin thought that the best bet was just to wait for Harry and Dave to resurface, at which point he and his men would pounce. And yeah, the sheriff's hunch was mostly correct. Tracy and Merrill stole another team of horses, along with a wagon, and passed through the towns of Oregon City, Milwaukee, and Selwood without incident. Upon reaching the Columbia River, they forced a couple of men at gunpoint to sell them across to Washington State, promising to send $50 for the trouble. Once on dry land, the pair took a meal at a farmhouse before again setting out on foot. They'd lay low in the forest that night and the next morning stop at an old German immigrant's house for breakfast, taking a fresh set of clothing while doing so and leaving the old man tied to the bed. He got loose, though, and the authorities were alerted, and once more there was a huge mobilization, mostly centered around the Vancouver, Washington area. You had lawmen from both Oregon and Washington, along with more National Guard and a shit ton of armed civilians. And the results were predictable. Hell, 2 different groups of vigilantes ended up getting so drunk they shot at each other in the dark. But the search continued, with Tracy and Dave still stopping at various farms and homesteads along the way for sustenance. And they really weren't hiding who they were. There were a few times where they'd claim to be deputies or part of the search party, but for the most part, Harry made no bones about his true identity, and oftentimes introduced himself simply as the convict Tracy. From the Columbia, they pushed up to the town of La Center, about 20 miles north of Vancouver, and from there, Cowlitz County, not far from Silver Lake. Just steadily headed north, and the authorities really couldn't do nothing but react. They'd wait until some farmer came forward saying that he spotted the escapees, then rush like hell with the bloodhounds. Dogs would pick up the scent for a couple of miles, and then nothing. Rinse and repeat. Finally, after about a month on the lam, Tracy shows up in Olympia alone. Stopped at a farm outside of town, tied the homeowner up, and cooked himself a meal, claiming that Dave Merrill was about a mile away guarding the road. Once done with his meal, Harry would steal a couple of horses and make his way to the southern shore of Puget Sound. It's there, early the next morning, where he marched into the offices of the Capital City Oyster Company, introduced himself as the convict Harry Tracy, and demanded breakfast. And as he ate, he confessed to a fresh murder. When one of the employees inquired as to Dave Merrill's whereabouts, Tracy nonchalantly replied, quote, I killed the son of a bitch 3 days ago. Shot him 3 times and threw his dead body under a clump of trees. End quote. After washing his bacon down with some fresh coffee, Harry ordered a few of the men onto an oyster boat and forced them to ferry him up the Puget Sound towards Seattle. During the trip, Tracy expounded upon his troubles with Dave, saying that they had been quarreling. A few days prior, they had come upon a newspaper article giving Merrill more credit than Tracy felt like he was due. Harry said that Dave didn't have the nerve of a rabbit and was oftentimes too scared to even approach farms for food. Quote, that isn't my style. No man can take me alone, and if I had a proper traveling companion, a man of nerve, I couldn't be taken by a regiment of deputies. If I am shot, it will be from behind. And with another man to guard the opposite direction, a man of some nerve who knew how to handle a gun, we could go wherever we wanted and not be compelled to keep under cover a portion of the time as I am when traveling alone. End quote. Tracy went on to say that Merrill was no good, that he was nothing but an impediment, and that he couldn't even be relied upon to keep guard throughout the night. Said he got mad when the paper gave Merrill equal credit and began taunting him, calling him a coward, and finally, they decided to fight a duel right then and there. Remember, this is according to Tracy, but he said they stood together, backs touching, and agreed to walk 10 steps forward before simultaneously turning and firing. A real old school gentleman's duel. However, Harry didn't trust Merrill to not turn prematurely, so after taking just 8 steps, he himself whirled around and put 3 bullets into Dave's back. In Tracy's mind, this was not a shameful action. He was fully convinced that Dave was going to cheat, so why give the man an opportunity? And just to kind of show how volatile Harry was, the captain of the oyster boat had to talk him out of shooting at other people on the Sound twice during the boat trip. As they passed a federal prison on McNeil Island, Tracy raised his rifle and said he was going to pick one of the guards off the wall. The captain pointed out that this would bring unwanted attention, and Tracy unenthusiastically agreed, instead satisfying himself by taking pot shots at a seal swimming near the shore. A little while later, while passing Point Defiance, a tugboat began barreling straight towards them. Once again, Harry shouldered his Winchester as the captain nervously explained that it was all in good-natured fun, just a joke, and that the boat would swerve out of the way as they got closer. Sure enough, it did, and the tugboat captain could be seen smiling and waving as they passed by. That evening, they docked on the eastern shore of the Sound, somewhere just to the north of Seattle, and Tracy tied the crew up. All except for one of them, that is, Frank Scott, who he instead held as a hostage. After promising to send the captain some money for his troubles, Tracy and Scott set off on foot towards the suburbs of Ballard. As they traveled, Harry was nice enough to give Frank the exact location of Merrill's body, sort of as a favor, saying that maybe he could collect the reward money. And after taking a breather on the railroad tracks, the two men bid each other adieu, with Tracy saying that he was headed into Seattle in order to hold up Clancy's saloon and hopefully get his hands on a brand new 6-shooter. Funny enough, Frank Scott would immediately quit his job with the Oyster Company and set out to find Merrill's body. No more fishing for Scotty, he told co-workers. After next week, I'll be living in luxury at the expense of the Oregon taxpayers. No idea whatever became of Mr. Scott, but he would not be the one to discover Merrill's remains. That distinction would fall to someone else entirely, but you're going to have to wait till later to learn who. Daddy's got to build a little suspense every now and then. Now, at this point, the investigation was taken over by King County Sheriff Edward Cudahy. A lifelong bachelor with no children, Sheriff Cudahy was 100% wholly devoted to the job. He also wasn't cursed with songs like Baby Shark or Wheels on the Bus being on constant repeat in his head, like I am. Must be nice. Now, this was not Cudahy's first rodeo. With over 20 years' experience wearing a badge, the sheriff had helped to arrest the notorious Seattle killer Thomas Blank a few years prior. And when Blank escaped from jail, Cudahy was involved in the successful manhunt that followed. And what's more, if the stories are true, one of his top deputies, Jack Williams, had investigated Tracy some 6 years prior when he was living in Seattle under that Tom Bliss alias. Once they learned that their prey had been spotted near the town of Bothell, Sheriff Cudahy immediately dispatched Deputy Williams and a small posse, with plans of joining them shortly to direct the search personally. In the meantime, Williams and his men began combing the railroad tracks east of Bothell towards Woodinville. When that proved fruitless, they turned their attention to the west, commandeering a large canoe and paddling their way along the shores of Lake Washington. And it's there, on a rainy July 3rd, 1902, that they came upon a secluded cabin that appeared suspect. Just the type of place that might provide shelter to a desperado like Harry Tracy. Now, in addition to Williams, you had a Deputy Nelson, another sheriff's deputy out of Snohomish County, Raymond, a volunteer named Brewer, and a couple of reporters. Believe it or not, that was actually pretty common during the Tracy manhunt, with reporters accompanying posses out in the field. And oftentimes, they were just as well armed as the lawmen. Now, the plan was to split up, with Williams, Brewer, and Nelson approaching the cabin from one side, as Deputy Raymond and the reporters brought up the flank. The men inched forward slowly, not just out of caution, but also due to the thick foliage surrounding the cabin. As the rain increased, their visibility was further limited, but they remained on high alert. Or so they thought. Problem was, they was focusing a little bit too much on that cabin. Imagine their surprise when Harry Tracy popped up, not from within, but rather from behind a large alder stump some 30 yards away, and sent a bullet creasing the cheek of one of the newspapermen, Carl Anderson. As Anderson fell backwards, Deputy Raymond crouched defensively in front of the wounded man, and tragically, his heroics were rewarded by 2 30-30 rounds to the chest. The remaining posse men rallied and continued their assault, but Tracy's aim was surgical, and Deputy Williams was the next to fall. Overwhelmed, the others rushed to Williams' aid and took refuge in the cabin as Harry made his getaway. Now, as dramatic as that gunfight was, the day wasn't over yet. Matter of fact, Tracy would kill twice more before the sun was fully over the horizon. Following the shooting of deputies Raymond and Williams, Tracy hijacked a wagon and forced its owner to drive him towards Seattle. Believe it or not, they actually passed a roadblock without drawing suspicion, and by nightfall were on the outskirts of Woodland Park. By the way, this is part 2 and the final installment in the series on Harry Tracy. To hear part 1, all about Harry's early life up to and including that gun battle with Deputy Williams that I just teased in the intro, check out the link down below in this episode's description. Once in Woodland Park, Harry, with the wagon driver Lewis Johnson as his hostage, ate dinner at the home of a Mrs. Van Horn. As he scarfed down his food, Tracy said that he was bound and determined to get into Seattle, said he'd feel safer there and wanted to be within the city limits proper by sunup, and his insurance, he'd bring Johnson with him. No hard feelings, though. At this point, Harry even had Johnson write down his full name and address, saying, quote, "I've troubled you a lot, and if I ever do get a big wad again, I'm going to make things square with you." At around 9 o'clock that evening, a grocery boy appeared, unbeknownst to Tracy, and Mrs. Van Horn quietly whispered for the kid to go fetch help. As luck would have it, Sheriff Cudahy was just a mile away in neighboring Fremont. He had just arrived via buggy, alone, from Bothell, and as soon as he heard that Tracy was holed up at the Van Horn place, immediately began asking for volunteers. A few brave citizens agreed, and once armed, they took up positions around the house. To their astonishment, moments later, Tracy emerges. Only problem is, he's flanked by hostages. The aforementioned Lewis Johnson and an old man named Butterfield who had the misfortune of boarding with Mrs. Van Horn. Keep in mind that Harry had no idea the sheriff was out there. He was just being his natural, cautious self. It was clear he was headed straight for the Johnson's wagon, so Cudahy took careful aim and waited, thinking that he'd get a clear shot once Tracy tried to climb aboard. And chances are he would have too, had it not been for a couple of unwitting constables, Raleigh and Brees, blundering onto the scene. I guess they had heard the news and were looking to come to Cudahy's aid. They spot Tracy, still flanked by Butterfield and Johnson, and ask the trio if they'd seen the sheriff anywhere. Seconds later, Brees notices the rifle that Harry was trying to conceal under his jacket, puts 2 and 2 together, and yells out for Tracy to drop the gun. Instead, Harry simply swings it out and puts a bullet square in Brees' forehead. Constable Raleigh is close enough to actually reach out and grab Tracy's arm, while at the same time attempted to draw his service pistol, but it's no use. Harry was just too damn quick, and he fished out a revolver of his own and pumped 2 rounds into Raleigh's belly. All of this happened in just a matter of seconds, mind you. Sheriff Cudahy and his makeshift posse scrambled to open up fire, at which point Tracy just disappears into the night. Now, Constable Raleigh would succumb to these wounds fairly quickly, and counting Brees and Deputy Raymond back at the cabin, Harry Tracy had just killed 3 men in the span of a few hours. 4 really, depending on how you look at it. Deputy Williams, who had been wounded back at the cabin, would go on to live several more years, but when he did finally die, it was from complications of those wounds he received back in the summer of 1902. The following day, July 4th, the good citizens of Seattle began arming themselves. Rifles were handed out at hardware stores as Sheriff Cudahy and a posse of 50 men began searching the woods between Seattle and Bothell. Others were strategically positioned at various points along roads and rail tracks, but mostly it was just a game of hurry up and wait. Tracy could be anywhere, holed up out in the woods or sitting in somebody's house watching all the commotion outside through a window. Unless he popped his head up or there was another sighting, the posses really couldn't do much of anything. Sheriff Cudahy admitted as much that evening during a press conference. Said he couldn't possibly say where Tracy was, but that he and his men were watching closely for the next appearance. Quote, "The chase has been a hard one, but we are not beaten yet. Tracy must be exhausted by his last flight across the country, and we must keep hard after him." End quote. And as had been the case for nearly the entire hunt, tips began flooding in. Some credible and others not so much. Tensions were so high that a poor Japanese man was nearly gunned down when a posse mistook him for Tracy. In truth, by the way, I'm recording this directly after I recorded the first episode in this series. If you hear my voice cracking, it's just because it's still not at 100% after that little cold I had a couple weeks ago. I feel fine though. My voice just isn't quite where it needs to be yet. Hopefully soon. Now, by the morning of the 4th, Harry had made his way all the way to Green Lake and held a farmer and his family at gunpoint while they made him breakfast. During the brief sojourn, Tracy described the previous day's events in vivid detail and retold the story about how he killed Dave Merrill, adding that he didn't want to hurt anybody except, quote, those who were after me, and I'm not going to forget those people that have done me favors, end quote. Almost as if to hammer this point home, Tracy refrained from tying the family up due to their 18-month-old baby, saying, I'll not tie you people up because somebody will have to tend to that baby. But one thing I want you to do, and that is to give me a solemn promise that you will not tell anyone I've been here for the next 48 hours, end quote. The farmers agreed. Of course they fucking did. They just wanted to be shut of the guy. And once again, Tracy departed with promises of money in the mail. Now, obviously, the couple didn't wait no 48 hours. They immediately notified the authorities, and the farmer's wife even stated that she tried to poison Tracy's food, but he was just watching too closely. The law quickly arrived on the scene, bloodhounds were dispatched, and surprise, surprise, they lost the scent after just about a mile. The general consensus was that Harry was now bound for the Cascades, but he fooled everybody again by going the exact opposite direction, right back to Puget Sound. Forced a fisherman to sail him all the way to Bainbridge Island, where, on the afternoon of the 5th, he held another family at gunpoint, the Johnsons. I want you all to understand that I am a desperate man. My name is Tracy, and I would kill you all were it not for that pretty little child. I want all I can get to eat and good clothes in place of the ones I have on. If you give me these things, you will not be harmed. Harry then addressed Miss Johnson, saying, Madam, I dislike to order a woman about, but I want you to hurry up and get me a big dinner. And I want lots of coffee. And I actually don't think that's a bad line. Some of you single guys might want to try someday, preferably on a first date. Just let me know how it works out. By 9 p.m., Tracy was gone, leaving with the Johnsons' hired hand, John Anderson, whom he then forced to row him from Bainbridge Island all the way back to a peninsula southwest of Seattle. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to play a little armchair fugitive for just a moment. I'm having a really hard time figuring out the reasoning behind sailing to Bainbridge Island and then back to the mainland all in the course of a day. If you look at a map, there's not a whole lot west of Bainbridge even nowadays, at least not in the way of civilization. Assuming Harry had enough ammunition and a little wilderness know-how, if he could have made his way to the Olympic Peninsula, where the present-day Olympic National Forest is located, I kind of feel like he could have hid out indefinitely. Then again, me personally, if I, God forbid, ever happen to be on the run from the law, I think I'd head to about the biggest city I could find, preferably somewhere with a lot of public transport, and just kind of melt in with the masses. And who knows, maybe that's why Harry Tracy was so bound and determined to get to Seattle. Maybe he felt safer among people. Or maybe he just didn't care to spend a long time in the forest by himself with nobody to talk to but Rosie Palm and her 5 sisters. That said, as you'll soon hear, there is some evidence that Tracy was receiving help from the outside. If he did try to rough it over there on the Olympic Peninsula, he'd be completely cut off from that assistance. Hell, there wouldn't even be farmers that he could turn to for food. This is all just speculation on my part. Like I said, Tracy had Anderson sail him all the way back just southwest of Seattle, and then, once on shore, he made the man carry all his food and ammo. Remember what I just said about help? Well, according to Mr. Anderson, he and Tracy marched through the forest toward the town of Renton, where they encountered 4 men, one of whom Harry greeted as Fred. He and Fred conversed for a while before Tracy tied Anderson up and blindfolded him, leaving one of the 4 to stand guard. Harry and the others returned about an hour later with a bottle of whiskey and continued their hike, all 6 of them. That evening, they took refuge near a railroad track, and once again, Anderson was tied up. This time left completely alone, but just like before, Tracy and the mystery men show back up at daylight. As far as Harry's overall condition goes, per Anderson, quote, Tracy never got tired. He was always walking fast and watching both sides. He got cross at me when I forced him to slow up sometimes. His health is good, and he hasn't a scratch. He has been eating heartily and regularly and has built up his strength and told me he was now in better condition to fight and travel than at any time since he left the penitentiary at Salem. He said, I'm getting stronger all the time, and I've never felt better in my life. End quote. Now, at some point, they broke off from the 4 allies, and Tracy came upon 2 girls and a young boy picking berries. Introducing himself as the famous fugitive, he accompanied them home, assuring them along the way that he would never hurt a woman. Once they arrived, Harry made the acquaintance of the family matriarch, a Mrs. Geralds, before leaving with the little boy as a hostage and returning shortly thereafter with Anderson. Tracy then gave the kid a couple of stolen watches and told him to go sell them over in Seattle and use the money to purchase a brace of revolvers. I want 2 Colt 45s and 2 boxes of cartridges. Now, if you preach on me, kid, you'll hear from me. Then, just to drive this threat home, within the boy's earshot, Tracy told his mama, if he betrays me, I'll kill your 2 other children, referencing the berry-picking sisters. This, of course, was just another one of Harry's bluffs, and once the boy departed, he assured Mrs. Gerald that she had absolutely nothing to fear. As for the kid, he had more pluck than Harry gave him credit for. Fearing for his mama and sisters, he immediately alerted the law, and it weren't long before a posse descended upon the Geralds' home. Tracy noticed him, though, and, as gentlemanly as could be, concocted a plan to have the women leave with him as a human shield, sort of like he did back at the Van Horn place. And just like before, all plans were immediately derailed by a pair of interlopers. And this next part is almost unbelievable. Apparently, 2 highly inebriated men, not part of the posse, just what the newspapers would later describe as meddling fools and idlers from Renton, drunkenly muscled their way inside and asked if Tracy was there. Harry hid in a room with the young ladies as Mrs. Gerald's assured the men that he was not. Finally, they just stumbled their way out, likely saving their own hides in the process. Weird little interlude, and it does seem pretty amazing that Tracy didn't kill both of them on sight. And you gotta wonder what the hell the posse outside was thinking. Up to that point, at least, they were under the assumption that they had gone unnoticed. Nonetheless, that night, once it was good and dark, Tracy tied Anderson up, and despite previous plans, he left alone, slipping quietly right through the posse just like he had done dozens of times before. You know, I do find Tracy to be a pretty fascinating study. The dude was a stone-cold killer, no doubt. I'm sure a little touched in the head, extremely dangerous, and he made no qualms about being a thief. But also, he did seem to go out of his way not to harm civilians. During Harry's time on the run, he took a ton of hostages, but never made any untoward advances on the womenfolk. About the worst he ever did was just leave a few people loosely tied up. He wouldn't hesitate to drop the hammer on anybody hunting him, be they lawman or vigilante, but everyone else seemed to be off limits. By all appearances, Harry Tracy lived by a code, albeit one of his own making. And this is something I've noticed when researching other criminals from different eras, even admitted crooks and gangsters from modern-day times. They all espouse a certain honor code, and some very strongly. I'm sure this is a topic more suited for a psychologist than a dumbass podcaster, but I've always wondered if these codes are true beliefs, guiding principles that they just really feel down to their core, or just more of a narcissistic coping mechanism. Maybe rather than accept who they are, they instead rewrite the narrative in their own minds. Sure, I might rob a bank, but I'd never hurt a kid, so I'm not all that bad. Or yeah, I'd shoot a cop trying to arrest me, but I've never touched a woman without consent. None of us, even bad boys, want to feel like monsters, right? Then again, there may be some truth to it. I mean, with all of Harry Tracy's faults, was he as bad as those prison guards that tortured Delmain back in the previous episode? Those guards were never hunted down like dogs or labeled as menaces of society. They never had a price on their head, and the warden that allowed all that shit to go on at his prison, the worst that ever happened to him was he lost his job. And I personally believe that one day I'll stand before my maker and have to answer for what I've done. I gotta admit that's a scary thought. Thankfully, I've never had to take a life, but I kind of feel like torturing somebody to death would be far harder to explain than shooting someone in self-defense. But just one more thought, and I promise I will stop rambling. As much as I sympathize with Harry Tracy, and by sympathize, I guess I mean I understand his reluctance to return to prison, I don't know that being nice to his hostages is all that great of a flex. At the end of the day, just the mere action of him forcing his way into those homes and holding families at gunpoint is dramatic as hell. The men were likely left with feelings of inadequacy for the rest of their lives, and the women never again able to feel safe in their own homes. In my opinion, being polite doesn't really make up for all that. And if one of those men had tried to fight back, Tracy sure as shit would have killed him. And it would have been his own damn fault. Now that posse did end up rushing to the Gerald's home in a huff, cutting Mr. Anderson free and putting the hounds on the scent using some old clothes that Tracy left behind. Per usual, the dogs lost the trail about a quarter mile down the road, but upon crossing the river, they immediately picked it back up. At least they did until they ran smack dab into a nice heavy dust and a cayenne pepper. Far as I know, that was the only time Harry tried that particular trick, and needless to say, it did hamper the chase quite a bit. Undaunted, the handler gave his dogs a good nose cleaning, whispered some sweet nothings in their ears, and in no time flat they were back on the hunt. And this time, for whatever reason, Tracy had a very hard time shaking them. He ended up doubling back, making a big circle through the timber and cutting his own trail, heading north again towards Lake Washington. The hounds followed, but by the time they hit the lake, the trail went completely cold. So demoralized were the volunteer posse men at this development that most of them just up and quit and went on back home. Harry didn't have that option, so instead he again changed directions and beat feet to the south. In the days that followed, there were numerous sightings, and someone fitting Tracy's description even forced his way into a home and attempted to use the telephone. Then, just outside of Tacoma, Harry took yet another family hostage, the Johnsons. After demanding food and a change of clothing, he ordered the man of the house to go into town and procure a pair of .45 Colts. Remember, he pulled that same shit back at the Gerald's home, so I'm guessing he really wanted those damn pistols. And once again, Tracy offered up a bluff. Told Johnson that if he didn't do as he was told, he'd murder his wife and children. In the meantime, Harry gathered the remaining family members, Johnson's wife, a 17-year-old daughter, and a 15-year-old son, and took them to a hill behind the house. Apparently, Tracy wanted a nice vantage point in case anyone tried sneaking up. And this next part is very interesting. While awaiting the return of Mr. Johnson and those two twin Colts, Tracy allegedly regaled the family with stories from his days riding with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Now take that with a grain of salt, as I don't know this is something that the Geralds said, or whether or not the local press just sprinkled it in to make the story more interesting. Much of what we know about Harry's time on the run does come from newspaper accounts, and you know how that be. Speaking of which, this wasn't just some local story. This manhunt had garnered national attention, and there were daily updates in damn near every paper in the United States. Even then, President Teddy Roosevelt was obsessed, following the news closely and allegedly somewhat intrigued by Tracy's ability to elude the law for as long as he had. So yeah, there's no telling what kind of stories the press was concocting on the daily just to drum up sales. I will say this much though. When Tracy was admitted into that prison back in Utah, his official description listed a bullet scar on his left leg. Where he got that wound, what the circumstances were, is anybody's guess. For sure, Harry Tracy was involved in more than what we're discussing here. I just wish I knew the particulars. You know, that crime that got him locked up in Utah was relatively petty, but who the hell knows what else he had done prior to getting caught? How often had he slipped in and out of Browns Park in the past? Is there any truth to him riding the OUTLAW trail in Montana? I wish I could say one way or the other, but for now, this will have to remain a mystery. If you have any additional information on Harry Tracy, if I've gotten anything glaringly wrong, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Josh@wildwestextra.com. I think one thing is clear, though. Tracy may or may not have rode with Butch Cassidy, but he could have. Hell, judging from his actions during this manhunt, Tracy would have fit right in with the James gang. Good, bad, or indifferent, the man had nerve and he had grit. Had he been born a decade or two prior, the name Harry Tracy might be among the most well-known of the Old West bad men. Now, Mr. Johnson did return. He was a good boy and kept his mouth shut, but he was only able to procure one revolver for Tracy. To make matters worse, it had a 7.5-inch barrel as opposed to the shorter 6-inch barrel that Harry had asked for. Tracy wasn't very happy, but he ended up cooling off rather quickly before air quotes borrowing a couple of dollars from Mr. Johnson. He then took everybody back inside, had Mrs. Johnson pack him up a passel of food, and after shaking hands all around, Tracy headed on down the road alone. Mrs. Johnson would later tell reporters that during the stay, Harry spoke twice of his mother, fondly, and that she could see tears welling up in his eyes. Now, as touching as that is, she also expressed fears that Tracy would return and kill her husband, saying that she wouldn't be able to sleep in her own home again until he is either dead or out of the country. As it turns out, she would not have long to wait. That evening, a little after midnight, Harry came upon two men guarding the railroad tracks and took off running. They unloaded their scatter guns after him, and despite the darkness, ended up putting at least a few pellets in Tracy's hip. He hobbled through the woods about 50 yards before running smack dab into another lawman, Deputy Crow. Harry pretended to be a fellow posseman, but as soon as he got close, he raised his rifle and popped off a couple of shots. Luckily for Crow, Tracy didn't stick around to make sure any of his bullets found their mark. Other than a slight powder burn on his face and an exciting story to tell his grandkids, Deputy Crow was unscathed and lit out for the nearest telegraph station. Skip ahead to 8 a.m. that morning. Sheriff Cudahy arrived on scene along with those bloodhounds, but, say it with me, class, the trail soon went cold. A couple hours later, Harry was spotted on a farm some 5 miles south of Covington Station. The hounds were once more deployed, and this time they were able to follow the trail for a full 8 miles, the longest thus far in the entire manhunt. However, just like always, they eventually lost the scent. The following day, July 12th, 1902, Tracy limped his way into the home of the Portraits, an elderly French couple. Said he was the man the posse was after and that he wanted some food. Now, if Tracy had previously been at the peak of physical fitness, as the hostage Anderson had claimed, things had recently taken a drastic turn for the worse. That hip wound was hurting something fierce, and according to the Portraits, Harry's face appeared thin, drawn tight and gaunt, and he was so exhausted he could barely lift his fork. Nevertheless, after finishing his meal, Tracy was on the move, limping his way back into the safety of the forest. He didn't look like a criminal, Mrs. Portrait later recalled. He treated us very nicely, and it is hard to believe that he has such a black record. Next day, around 5 p.m., Harry was spotted by a 10-year-old boy just south of Enumclaw. The kid would later state that Tracy seemed very tired, with dark circles under his eyes, and that he carried a Winchester in his arms with a makeshift holster around his waist holding 2 revolvers. Harry asked the kid for directions to the road leading to Buckley, thanked him, and went along his way. The youngster immediately pedaled into Enumclaw and alerted the adults. There was a great clamor of hounds and men, but Harry had done circled back and it weren't no use. On the afternoon of the 14th, Tracy was still in the vicinity of Enumclaw, where he forced his way into the Garner home. Fugitive ate dinner, ordered one of the Garner boys to give him a shave, and then departed with a new pair of pants. Meanwhile, Sheriff Cudahy decided to follow a somewhat iffy lead. More and more intel kept coming his way, backing up the idea that Tracy was receiving outside help, and what seemed like a reliable informant even claimed to know the exact location of their hideout, a remote cabin on Lake Sawyer. Desperate to make an arrest, Cudahy took 12 of his best men and made the long hike, getting lost twice in the process before finally locating the cabin. They breached the doors, guns drawn, and it was empty. While there were remnants of an old fire and what appeared to be bloody rags in the corner, Harry Tracy was nowhere to be found. Defeated and deflated, Sheriff Cudahy quit the search completely, returned home, and said that he would not go out into the field again unless he had definitive news. And I think I do understand the man's frustration. It was like chasing after a damn ghost. Couple that with all the fake Harry Tracys that began popping up, and it had to be downright frustrating. There was one jokester who walked into a logging camp demanding dinner, and although he was armed, he did not match Harry's description. But that's nothing compared to a genius by the name of William Nixon. Old Willie entered into a Seattle saloon and began quietly intimidating one of the female employees, claiming to be Tracy and strong-arming her into buying him beer. Said if she told anyone, there would be consequences. Well, she told, and the next time Nixon set foot in that saloon, he got his ass beat black and blue and locked up in jail to boot. Hell of a price to pay for a free beer. Meanwhile, the real Harry Tracy had indeed crossed the Cascades on horseback and pushed into the much more open and arid land of eastern Washington. Not far from Wenatchee, Harry stopped at a fruit ranch, taking both a meal and a fresh mount, before pushing on to the Columbia River, where he ran into a pair of stubborn ferry operators who flat out refused to take him across until sunup. Guess they was allergic to working in the dark. Tracy spent a few nervous hours watching his back trail before impatiently waking the men up at first light. And once on the other side of the river, Harry refused to pay him. Said that he was broke, but even if he had money, he wouldn't hand it over due to their uncooperativeness. Now, I don't know why I found that so funny. In the past 2 months, Tracy has killed, 7 men? The 3 guards at the prison, Dave Merrill, Deputy Raymond over at the cabin, then Brees and Raleigh at the Van Horn home, and he left another Deputy Williams all but dead. Dude was absolutely not afraid to pull a trigger, yet for whatever reason, he put up with insubordination from these damn ferry operators. Kind of reminds me of that scene from No Country for Old Men, where Anton Chigurh is arguing with that old lady at the trailer park, looking for Llewellyn. Those ferry operators, much like that fictional lady, had just come across the deadliest person they would ever encounter for the rest of their lives. Yet they somehow stumbled away without so much as a scratch. Who knows, maybe this was just part of Tracy's code, or maybe he was just plumb tuckered out. I don't know. Either way, news began to spread as Tracy worked his way east through the towns of Elmira and Wilbur. Even Sheriff Cudahy got excited about the numerous sightings and decided to investigate in person. The working theory now was that Tracy was bound for the hole in the wall over in Wyoming, looking to take refuge with his own. If that's the case, the man had quite the long journey ahead of him. Unfortunately, we'll never know, as Tracy's days were about to come to a very abrupt end. Somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd of August, Harry was discovered by a 19-year-old kid named George Goldfinch. Young George had been out riding, alone, when he came upon Tracy's solitary camp. Harry invites the kid to take a load off, insists that he stay for dinner, and they even discuss a recent boxing match, Jeffries versus Fitzsimmons. Somewhere during the conversation, Tracy introduces himself proper and informs George that he is now a hostage. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you. I just want you to guide me to the nearest ranch," which Goldfinch does, taking Harry to the Eddy spread, ran by brothers Lou and Gene Eddy. Tracy enjoys dinner there at the Eddy Ranch and, uncharacteristically, lets George Goldfinch go on back home. Apparently, George told him that if he didn't return soon, his people would grow suspicious. Surprisingly, however, Goldfinch did not go running his mouth off. Matter of fact, he returned to the ranch the very next day, thinking that Tracy would be long gone. Only thing is, he weren't. Truth is, Harry had his sleeves rolled up and was in the process of helping the Eddys build a new barn. You know how secrets are, though. They're not the easiest things in the world to keep bottled up inside, especially when you're 19 and the secret in question has a large sum of money on its head. This time after George left, he did start talking, and word spread throughout the nearby towns of Davenport and Creston. Indeed, there in Creston, an ensemble of unlikely heroes began to form. Turns out a youngster named Joseph J. Morrison overheard the news and began gathering his buddies, all of them rank amateurs in their early to mid-20s. And I say amateurs, but that's not exactly correct. They were just very inexperienced in the ways of manhunting. One of them, Maurice Smith, had served in the Spanish-American War, but he was a lawyer by trade, and a recent transplant from back east. Likewise with E.C. Lanter, just 23 years of age and fresh out of medical school. These three attempted to recruit George Goldfinch to guide him to the Eddy place, but young George refused, thinking that Tracy might not be happy with him after this recent turn of events. So instead, they enticed one of Morrison's hunting buddies, Frank Lillengren. To round out the posse and give it an air of legitimacy, they also talked part-time constable C.A. Straub into going with them. On August 6, 1902, they made their way to the Eddy Ranch in a buggy, finishing the last leg of the journey on foot so as not to draw attention. And believe it or not, these wannabe vigilantes were able to sneak all the way up to that barn and get to within 50 yards of the notorious Harry Tracy. Worth pointing out that these guys were a nervous wreck by this point. The doctor, E.C. Lanter, wasn't armed with nothing but an old black powder gun of dubious reliability, so he urged the lawyer, Maurice Smith, to take the shot. But I guess being the gentleman he was, Smith decided to give Harry a chance to surrender. "Throw your hands up, Tracy," Smith barked in the most authoritative voice he could muster, and Harry did exactly what he was told. He put his gun down and came out, hands in the air, meek as a damn kitten. He even began thanking the men, saying that he was glad that his long flight was finally over. And no, I just made that last part up. Of course Harry Tracy didn't surrender. At the sound of Smith's voice, Tracy immediately dove into the barn towards that trusty Winchester of his. Still uncertain as to who he was up against and how many there was, Harry then made his way from the back of the barn to a hayfield. Both Lanter and Morrison noticed and put their long guns into action. Harry did the same, turning and snapping off a few shots with his Winchester as he ran, before diving among some large rocks for cover. As he did so, he tripped and lost control of the rifle and had to scramble to retrieve it. By this time, all 5 men of the posse were rushing out into the field right at him, so Tracy started firing off rounds in earnest. And while he did succeed in stopping their advance, all his bullets were strangely falling short. Not only was Tracy fighting with the setting sun directly in his eyes, but as would later be determined, during that fall he had knocked loose the front sight of his rifle, thus rendering it practically ineffective at anything past a couple of dozen yards. Since it was now or never, the boys from Creston split up and tried to flank Harry, forcing him to leave the rocks and making a dash for a basin in the distance. Of course, their aim weren't much better than his. Maurice Smith was basically just walking rounds in on Tracy. Anytime the fugitive would appear in a break in the tall grass for just a second or two, Smith would fire, look for the dust plume, and adjust aim. This happened a few times before finally he thought he got a hit. Excited, Smith quickly unloaded his gun in that general area, and then quiet. A deafening silence fell as the young heroes strained their senses to pick up any sign of movement in the tall grass. All of a sudden, Lanter raised his rifle and let her rip, but just turned out to be a rather large hog, who squealed in fright and ran off back towards the barn. Crazy as it sounds, this did help to break the tension somewhat, as the emotions of the last few minutes caused the young men to begin laughing uncontrollably. Here they were, chasing after a confirmed killer, still out there and as dangerous as a cornered mountain lion, and they was giggling like school children. At least they were, until they heard a muffled shot from what sounded like a pistol. Seeing as how the sun was going down, and none of them felt that strongly about going into the tall grass in the dark, they decided to stay put where they were and wait till daybreak. Round about midnight, here comes Sheriff Gardner of Lincoln County, and he too thought it would be a wise choice to wait until morning. At least he did until first light. As the men of the posse mustered up courage to descend into the tall grass once more, the brave sheriff declined to join them. Even so, Lanter and Smith advanced cautiously, rifles at the ready, until they found what they was looking for. Not 20 yards from where Smith thought that he got off that lucky shot the day before lay Harry Tracy, covered in dirt and blood and deader than disco. Upon further inspection, they saw that at least one of Smith's rounds shattered Harry's right leg and likely severed his large artery. Tracy applied his belt as a tourniquet, but I reckon he saw the writing on the wall. Quickly losing his life strength and unable to move, Harry pulled his own revolver, placed it against his right eye, and pulled the trigger. Sheriff Gardner, sensing all the commotion, rushed out immediately and began waving his pistol around and demanding to take charge of the situation. Sometime later that day, Harry's body was hauled to the town of Davenport, where a mob of souvenir hunters were awaiting. Lining up on both sides of the street, they began reaching out and pulling off buttons at first, and then just flat out ripping off pieces of Tracy's clothing. And that was just the beginning. Once the body was placed inside the coroner's office, the crazed crowd busted in the windows and stormed inside. Within minutes, Tracy was stripped completely naked as the damn human vultures tore away his hair and skin, leaving the corpse absolutely riddled with bloody patches where entire chunks of flesh had been hacked away. Sheriff Cudahy, who had arrived in town just a few minutes prior, was so overcome by the scene that he began sobbing. Now, there was a bit of a dust-up as to who got to claim Tracy's body. Sheriff Cudahy could have done so had he chose, as he did still hold a warrant on the man, but he was as done could be at this point. He just up and left town. Stalwart Sheriff Gardner said that it was he who should deliver Harry's body back to Oregon and get the reward, since he was killed in his jurisdiction, but them young posse men who did all the work refused to let the lawman at the body. Good for them. Finally, the governor ordered Creston Constable Straub to take possession and oversee the transport back to that prison down in Salem. And you're not going to believe this next part. Before they loaded Tracy onto a train bound for Oregon, they poured acid all over his face just as a way to dissuade any future trophy hunters. Guess the idea was to make him look as unrecognizable as possible. Even still, Constable Straub had to physically sit on the coffin for the entire train ride, clutching a rifle. According to his interview with the Spokane Spokesman Review, if he hadn't, quote, souvenir hunters would have cut so many chunks off it that there wouldn't have been much left, end quote. Be that as it may, a mob was still able to power their way through as the coffin was being transferred to a wagon down in Salem. The lunatics managed to smash the casket into pieces and made off with the splinters, along with even more strips of Harry's putrefied skin. Good Lord. Eventually, what was left of the poor bastard was laid to rest in an unmarked grave there at the Oregon State Penitentiary, covered up with a heap of lime, right alongside his old buddy / murder victim, Dave Merrill. Now, Merrill's body had been discovered way back on July 15th, and sure enough, just like Tracy had stated, Dave had 3 bullet holes in his back. Apparently, a lady had been out walking with her son when the kid got a good whiff of the decomposing body. One of those smell it before you see it kind of deals. Dave's brother, Benjamin Merrill, was able to positively ID the body, as did the prison warden. And no, neither the woman nor her son were given any of the reward money. The governor of Oregon even released an official statement trying to rationalize his decision, basically saying that the bounty was offered as a way to entice men to risk their lives in search of the fugitive, and that simply stumbling upon a dead body while picking berries or walking was just pure dumb luck, blah, 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 blah. Typical politician bullshit. Speaking of rewards, you will read that the bounty on Tracy's head had reached over $4,000. Not sure how true that is, but the final amount they ended up getting paid was just $2,500. And you better believe Sheriff Gardner, who showed up after the fact and didn't even have balls to go into that tall grass after Tracy, tried to claim it as his own. The nerve on this guy. Hell, so did George Goldfinch. Remember him? At least he had a semi-legitimate claim, as he was the one who first spread news as to Tracy's location over at the Eddy Ranch. There was a lawsuit, but in the end, the reward was divvied up among those 5 amateur possemen: Smith, Lanter, Morrison, Lillengren, and Straub. And I think that's fair. They would have each ended up with around the equivalent of $15,000 in today's money. And I doubt they had to buy their own drinks for quite some time. Now, like I said earlier, for research, I leaned heavily on the book The Saga of the Outlaw Harry Tracy by James J. Nystrom. And if you don't mind, I think the last couple of paragraphs from Mr. Nystrom's book are a fitting end to this story. The furor that Harry Tracy created in the months in which he had been hunted slowly died down, even in the places he had passed through on his mission to escape. Today there are few markers on his trail of mayhem, no placards where he shot it out with deputies or held hostages for days. The man who so boldly and brazenly marched across 500 miles of thick underbrush, tall grass, and dense forests has left only the impression of a memory. People living in these areas held vivid memories of the circumstances throughout their lives. Today, all those who remembered are gone. It is their descendants who keep only a memory of a memory. Perhaps it is fitting that this outlaw, no matter how bold and daring, has left little or no trace on the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. His deeds and exploits should not be overly aggrandized, since he was, in fact, a convicted criminal, a thief, and a cold-blooded murderer. He was also very polite, courteous to women, not a wanton killer, but a self-justifying dispenser of his own crude code of frontier justice, with a keen though rough-hewn sense of humor. The story remains as a monument in the factual history of the growth of a region, the Pacific Northwest. It is still the same land that it was in Harry Tracy's time. Even though now it is widely settled and much of the dense undergrowth and timber has been cleared, the countryside still retains its basic wildness and overgrown nature. It does not take much neglect for the rain-soaked climate and fertile soil to reclaim its prominence over any kind of civilized activity. It is within this cover that the outlaw Harry Tracy hid from capture and eluded every posse that was dispatched to capture him. It was perhaps only in the Pacific Northwest that Harry Tracy could have been able to become a legend, however fleeting. Well said, Mr. Nystrom, and with that, I reckon that's about all I got on Harry Tracy. Thank you so much for listening. Please, if you like what you hear, share this episode. And if you're looking for more true tales from the Wild and Woolly West, head on over to wildwestextra.com. While you're there, hit that contact button. Let me know what's on your mind. That's wildwestextra.com. All right, I hope you and yours have a very happy Thanksgiving. Hope you stuff yourself silly with turkey and pie. And if you're a hunter, I hope you got a deer already. And I hope that the Dallas Cowboys lose. How about that? Till next time, try not to break the law. You might find yourself bleeding out in a Washington hayfield, and nobody deserves that, not even Cowboys fans. Adios.